Observing the conflicts of other nations offers invaluable military lessons. Crucially, all knowledge about the evolution of warfare can be acquired without spending your own nation's blood and money. Consequently, militaries have dispatched officers for centuries to study and report on foreign wars. The American Civil War, ACW, was no exception, but the lessons gathered were often dismissed. Although European missions gained valuable insights into how the war in the United States was changing gunpowder warfare, these insights were overshadowed by conflicting lessons derived from European conflicts. This error, however, wouldn't become critical until 1914. Welcome to our latest video on the American Civil War, where we dedicate an episode to the European observers who came to witness the conflict, examining their conclusions about the bloodiest battles ever fought on American soil. Europe's perspective. Europe was captivated by the American Civil War. In the 19th century, most Europeans knew little about the United States beyond its role in promoting the ideals that sparked the French Revolution in 1789 and the European revolutions of 1848, alongside any news from immigrant communities. While most governments publicly supported the Union and rejected the Confederacy over slavery, European aristocrats privately hoped the South would win. This preference was partly due to their greater affinity for the South's planter gentry over the northern bourgeoisie. The main reason, however, was that if American democracy failed, it would suppress their own internal democratic movements, thereby preserving the conservative order. Additionally, the war proved timely for European militaries. The Crimean War and the Italian War of 1859 clearly demonstrated that new technology was transforming warfare, but the exact mechanism was unclear. The Industrial Revolution hadn't fully impacted the nations in those earlier conflicts, muting its military effects. However, the American North was more industrialized than most of Europe, suggesting it would provide the answers regarding industrialization's influence on combat. Finally, this was the first chance for most of Europe to see how the Americans actually fought. Only the French, British, and Spanish had first-hand accounts from the American Revolution. The rest of Europe relied on indirect reports at best. When the U.S. fought Britain again in the War of 1812 and decisively defeated Mexico in 1848, Europe was too preoccupied by the Napoleonic Wars and domestic instability, respectively, to pay attention. The ACW offered their first opportunity to evaluate the capabilities of a democratic army. The missions. While Abraham Lincoln readily welcomed European observers to the north, he granted them access to the south only reluctantly. However, official observers held special diplomatic privileges that compelled his compliance. Given Europe's fascination with the south, refusing access across battle lines or through the blockade could have caused a major diplomatic incident. Thus, they were permitted to travel freely. That said, not every European power prioritized the ACW. The Kingdom of Italy, having unified barely a month before the war started, was too focused on national formation. Managing the fallout from absorbing the Kingdom of Naples and ongoing tension with the Pope were far higher priorities. Meanwhile, Austria's observers' reports were dismissed. Austria had limited official contact with the U.S., and its profoundly conservative military was highly resistant to reform. Austria had only begun forced modernization after its defeat in 1859, and initial reports confirmed prior conclusions from that war. Consequently, the emperor and his generals lost interest, viewing the American war as a minor curiosity. Later reports raising serious concerns about the Austrian army's readiness for modern warfare were ignored. It would take a future defeat to enforce meaningful reforms. Similarly, the Ottoman Empire sent formal observers, but it remains unclear what, if any, lessons were adopted. The Ottoman army had just gone through a difficult modernization phase before the Crimean War. That conflict exposed continued shortcomings, yet there was little appetite for further reform in the 1860s. Thus, the Sublime Porte archived and largely forgot the reports. The Russian reform refusal. The Russians officially displayed minimal interest in the ACW, but this wasn't due to a lack of desire to learn. Russia had been humiliated by its defeat in the Crimean War and was already struggling with military modernization. All the Tsar's resources and energy were focused on implementing the current round of martial and domestic reforms, which the conservative military and aristocracy were heavily resisting. Officially, incorporating new American lessons was out of question. Unofficially, Russia was watching keenly. In September 1863, Russian naval squadrons unexpectedly arrived in San Francisco and New York. While seen at the time as supporting the Union, they were actually hiding from the British and French. Russia feared that France or Britain might intervene in the Polish January uprising and did not want its fleet trapped in port again. Although not an official mission, the Russians spent their time in the U.S. intensely studying coastal bombardment, blockade maintenance, and ironclad construction. The Russian Navy was captivated by the USS Monitor, as it was precisely the ship they needed against the British and French Baltic fleets. Following the war, Russia purchased several Passaic-class monitors directly from John Ericsson. While the Army primarily modernized along French and Prussian lines, some American influence permeated. Russia's first modern breech-loading rifles were American designs.
During the 1870s, the Russian cavalry reforms sparked a debate between those advocating for American-style independent cavalry divisions and those supporting the traditional shock cavalry regiments. Ultimately, some units adopted carbines for deep penetration rating and scouting, while others retained their sabers and lances, resulting in considerable confusion over the cavalry's new military role. The Franco-Prussian perspective. There is no evidence that Helmut von Moltke dismissed the ACW as two armed mobs chasing each other around the country, from which nothing can be learned. Such a comment would have been profoundly uncharacteristic. Moltke knew that complacency had caused Prussia's disaster during the Napoleonic Wars, and fostered intellectual curiosity within the Prussian general staff to ensure they never missed military advancements again. Consequently, he sent an official mission and encouraged junior officers to take leave and observe the conflict personally. France felt similarly, sending numerous officers early on, many of whom served on George McClellan's staff during the Peninsula Campaign. In 1864, an official mission was dispatched to study the Army of the Potomac's logistical system, though it was curtailed by rising tensions over France's invasion of Mexico. Both France and Prussia eventually reached the same conclusion. While both the North and South displayed an impressive ability to rapidly create armies, their war was so unlike anything that could occur in Europe that the lessons were not applicable. The most widely read reports came from Prussian Captain Justus Scheibert, whose military conclusions were echoed by all French and Prussian observers. Scheibert lavishly praised Southern officers, bordering on hero-worshipping Robert E. Lee. However, he balanced this bias by acknowledging that the North's industrial capacity guaranteed its long-term victory, and commended the inter-service cooperation between the U.S. Army and Navy. Both he and the French were impressed by the professionalism of American artillery crews, and admired the enthusiasm, determination, and endurance of the American soldier. Nevertheless, the central theme of all observers' work was the fundamental difference between Europe and America. Both delegations agreed that the U.S. lack of a large professional officer corps and a standing army ensured a prolonged, bloody war. Scheibert admired the volunteer officers' and soldiers' ability to learn quickly, but argued they shouldn't have been forced to. He claimed that Europe's highly trained, disciplined conscripts, led by professionals, would have won the war swiftly through a few decisive field battles. As the war dragged on and battles increasingly relied on field fortifications and siegecraft, he attributed this to the inability of insufficiently trained officers to adapt to changing battlefield conditions. The French emphasized that America's geography was vastly larger and more rugged than Europe's, making European strategy and tactics impossible. In the 1859 war, France, Sardinia, and Austria concentrated 350,000 soldiers in Lombardy, a province roughly the size of New Hampshire. It was considered dangerously unwise in Europe to separate individual armies by more than 50 kilometers. Yet the Union's armies operated independently along a front over 1,500 kilometers long. While necessary, this dispersal prevented the decisive concentration required to win battles conclusively. European armies fought by concentrated artillery to break formations, followed by infantry employing fire and advance tactics, culminating in a decisive bayonet charge. Shock cavalry would rout the enemy, with light cavalry pursuing to finish the job, thereby conclusively winning the battle. These tactics succeeded because European battles took place in open fields and meadows, with long sight lines. In contrast, America was predominantly hilly woodlands. The enemy was rarely visible beyond 100 meters, severely limiting artillery's effectiveness in disrupting formations. Infantry was forced into prolonged, close-quarter slugfests, unthinkable in Europe. And even if Americans had possessed heavy cavalry, the broken terrain would have nullified its value. Therefore, they concluded that the ACW did not model European wars and offered limited relevant insights. Meanwhile, the British. As the only European power with extensive North American holdings, Great Britain had a more immediate and pressing interest in the ACW. The two nations had already fought two wars and nearly engaged in conflict over a border dispute in 1859. Since future conflict was plausible, the British observed the war closely. Two official military missions studied Union industry, fortifications, and artillery, while covertly assessing the power of their potential enemy. Additionally, numerous officers and journalists arrived to observe and report. Their extensive reports yielded mixed results. While the British public was strongly pro-Union, the pro-Southern aristocracy was more influential. Many of the most widely read reports, written by journalists and some officers, were human interest pieces focused on Southern culture. Most famously, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Fremantle traveled through 9 of the 11 Confederate states and observed the Battle of Gettysburg. His bestseller, 3 Months in the Southern States, highly praised the Southern people and read more like a travelogue than a military report. The more militarily useful results both reassured and alarmed London. On the one hand, reports on industrialized logistics, modern weaponry, and command developments confirmed lessons learned from the British Army's poor performance in the Crimean War. This led to new urgency being placed on ongoing modernization and reform programs. Of course, the Army's program was largely overshadowed by the Royal Navy's rush to replace its wooden ships after the Battle of Hampton Roads. On the other hand, many observers were shocked by how quickly the U.S. transformed from having almost no military into one comparable to continental standing armies. They warned that the U.S. could raise, train, and equip an army capable of conquering British North America before London could adequately respond. This reinforced London's existing policy of avoiding confrontation with the United States.
Fletcher sees the future. Colonel Henry Fletcher, in his reports and book, History of the American War, issued a further warning. This American army was more dangerous than it appeared. While seeming undisciplined and amateurish by European standards, it was adapting and learning from mistakes far faster than any European army could. Europe's officer corps was drawn from the aristocracy, and the rank and file primarily from the poorest classes. The middle classes were largely excluded from the military establishment. All decision-making flowed from the top down, and despite their professionalism, European armies were rigidly bound by tradition. In contrast, the Union Army was egalitarian, drawing personnel from all classes into all ranks. The average American soldier was better educated than his British counterpart, meaning the army learned both from the top down and the bottom up. Consequently, this democratic army recognized that improved artillery and battlefield conditions rendered rigid formations useless, leading them to naturally adopt looser and more mobile formations. Their preference for fighting from natural cover and prepared fortifications was the logical response to deadlier modern weapons. These tactics spread organically through both armies without a formal decision, something Fletcher argued would never be allowed in a European army, representing a major European weakness. 19th-century European wars were fought for limited political goals, while the ACW was a fight to the death between nations. Britain's all-volunteer professional army was ideal for limited conflicts and colonial wars. However, if forced into a total war like the Americans experienced, this army would be rapidly depleted. Britain would be forced to create a new army from conscripts and volunteers, just as the Americans had. Therefore, Fletcher argued that mandatory military service should be implemented for all classes to prepare the currently non-military British public for future wars. He also advocated for raising public education and physical fitness standards to match what he observed in America, stressing the need for West Point-style comprehensive officer training. When a total war eventually arrived, Britain would require a much larger pool of trained and capable recruits. The forgotten lessons.
Unlike the observations of many reform-minded officers, something concrete resulted from Fletcher's reports. The Royal Military College of Canada was explicitly established thanks to his writings. However, for the most part, Europe proceeded as if it had learned nothing from the American Civil War. The idea that Europe should have learned from it barely existed until scholars in the 1930s, like Basil Little Hart and H.J.F.C. Fuller, sought to explain why Europe destroyed itself during the Great War. They argued that Britain should have realized future wars would follow the ACW's example. However, this conclusion was illogical at the time. While the ACW clearly foreshadowed World War I in retrospect, it was completely overshadowed by the German unification wars. At the time, Prussia's easy victory in the Second Schleswig War, 1864, followed by its resounding defeat of Austria in a month in 1866, and the humiliation of France in 1870, leading to the birth of the German Empire, reinforced a different narrative. The subsequent 1877 Russo-Turkish War further confirmed that European wars were won quickly and decisively through large standing armies, superior technology, strategy, and railways, and could be kept politically limited. Thus, in the short term, the Franco-Prussian conclusion was correct. The American Civil War did not apply to Europe. Unlike that long, grueling conflict, European wars were, in fact, quick and decisive. It wasn't until Europe finally fought a true total war that anyone questioned whether they could have learned from the Americans half a century earlier. By then, of course, it was far too late.